Well, crew, thank you all so much for joining me for this important roundtable discussion on promoting race and equity in the NBA. Before we go any further, we have a few introductions to make. Obviously, this is our TV broadcast crew for the Thunder. First, we have Michael Cage, the TV analyst. We have Chris Fisher, play-by-play for the Thunder, and we have Nick Gallo, sideline reporter. And I'm Paris Lawson, the team's broadcast reporter and digital reporter as well. And guys, we all, as you can tell, have a unique perspective here, not only with our proximity to the league, but our roles kind of as messengers and communicators as well. And we've seen, especially this year, this conversation on race and equity in the league be really on the forefront in a lot of different ways. And we've been impacted and experienced that in kind of unique ways. But before we get to this year, I kind of want to take it back a little bit. And Michael Cage, I want to offer this up to you because you have a lot of experience with this league, from playing in it to also now analyzing the game. As you look back over the history kind of the NBA, what are some of the milestones that stick out to you that were relevant to promoting race and equity?
Well, first of all, Paris and my esteemed colleagues, I'd have to take you back to 1950, where the first African-American player, Errol Lloyd, was allowed to play in the NBA. I think that started it. And when you think about 1950, think about what was going on. You know, the lunch counters, sit-outs, a lot of white-only signs around the country. You know, a lot of things going on in terms of race relations, and the NBA just made a stance. We're going to allow the first person of color to play in the league. And that started in 1950. And man, that's, you take a big chance with something like that, especially with the energy around the racial, I guess, inequality and violence that was going on at the time. Now, I wasn't even born in 1950, but I certainly know that that was the first African-American player that was that played in the NBA. And then, you can fast forward from there, the really just the next level vision that the NBA was trying to have. And I'll talk about 1964 now, in which a group of players got together and wanted to boycott the 1964 All-Star Game. And that was something that was really huge because the NBA had never been on TV, okay? They didn't have a union. They wanted to be recognized, the players, as a union. And for the league at that moment, there was going to be a boycott. We're talking about some of the greatest guys, the Oscar Robinsons, the Jerry West, who is the logo for the NBA. You see that famous symbol, all decided, hey, we're not going to play unless we get certain concessions. And one of the concessions was to be recognized, their union to be recognized. And I think that's where I think the NBA has set itself apart. Its leadership back then in 1964, saying, hey, look, okay, better wages. We acknowledge your union, because a couple of years later, then football started their union because of the success of the NBA and the NBA Players Association ability to work together. Now, I'm gonna stay with that word there, work together. And that was like revolutionary back in those days, because 4 years after the NBA accepted or acknowledged the Players Association union, recognizing that this is something we need a working agreement to be able to move forward. Baseball did the same, and we are benefiting a lot from that collaboration, that acknowledgement of the league, just being able to say, what do the players want? Can we make this happen? And that will take you right on up until Black Lives Matter on the court last summer in Orlando, where we had never seen anything like that, because it was a statement that the players wanted to express themselves, but also I thought the league was saying, look, we understand, this is us. This is not you. This is a problem, social injustice, racial inequality we all have to deal with. And to see that there, in 2020, just really speaks volumes about the league and its ability to work together with the players and the owners.
Mike, something that's really interesting about that, and when I was doing my research on this a little bit in understanding Earl Lloyd and Chuck Cooper, those players that sort of trailblazed the movement for African Americans to get into the NBA back in the 1950s. If you were to ask the average person, can you tell me the significance of those guys? The majority of people would probably say no. But if you were to say, what's the significance of Jackie Robinson? Of course they know. I'd say he broke the color barrier for baseball. You can't say that about the NBA because baseball was the prominent sport back then. And I think it goes to show how far the NBA has come in a lot of ways, because the NBA has become so much more prominent in a lot of ways because of sort of those race relations over the last few decades. And I think that was something that really kind of struck me that was interesting, because I didn't know Earl Lloyd was the first Black person to play in an NBA game. And that's even for me, who's followed this league my entire life and love sports and all that kind of stuff. So that was one very interesting distinction. And along those lines, Mike, I think that one of the more distinctive moments for us and our generation has to be Donald Sterling and what took place in 2014 on a more recent basis, because of just how important that moment was in sort of empowering the players, giving the players the confidence to stand up for themselves, to stand up against what ultimately was a racist person who had involvement in the NBA, who was an owner of a team. That Clippers team was willing to protest an NBA playoff game, which at the time it was unthinkable. Like, the players aren't going to play, but the moment was so big, and it struck us all a certain way that I don't think that we'd ever felt before. And I think that that's one thing that started the relationship between the players and owners, the player empowerment, the players' confidence to speak out, and ultimately the players' confidence to protest, which we saw during the 2020 season with Black Lives Matter and in the bubble. So I think it was a very, very critical moment that we all have to kind of look back to in 2014.
Well, the through line of what both of you guys are talking about is player empowerment, and really the agency to be able to make choices about their careers, about whether they are going to go out and play that playoff game, Chris. And I think that goes back, Michael, to what you said about unionizing. But the big moment that we have not talked about yet was Oscar Robertson's lawsuit in 1970, suing for free agency. Ultimately rang in a verdict in 1976 with Paul Silas kind of taking the lead there. And that gave NBA players the right to free agency. And that completely changed the dynamics for a league that was becoming increasingly more comprised of Black players. And since then, players have commanded more and more power. And really, those words, free agency, freedom and agency. And so much of that comes down to the financial freedom to be able to make choices, to vote with your feet effectively, to decide, hey, this is a situation where there's maybe racism, or there's an issue going on where I don't feel like I'm being treated fairly or with respect. I can vote with my feet. I can go somewhere else and play for somebody else that I respect and that respects me. And so I think free agency, in combination with the unionization, provided players in a league that was becoming majority Black the ability to stand up for themselves and not allow for themselves to be taken advantage of or abused in varieties of ways.
Hey, Nick, now also too, I really, what you and Chris said resonates with me, because what it's led to is today that any player, Black or white or any other nationality, can feel free to come out and say, I don't like this, or I don't like this. It doesn't have to be an issue with race. It could be an issue with religion. And I'd like to think that these, pioneers, these gentlemen that you guys just spoke about, and these polarizing moments such as free agency, the right to be able to have that in your control, is what's given way to this open platform for, I think, the players to feel, to feel acknowledged, to feel like I'm not going to be threatened, as some of the players felt like in the 1950s, where, if you're on this line over here, this is going to hurt you endorsement wise. this is going to hurt your career, and they put it all on the line so that I think guys can speak out like what you were talking about, Chris, the Donald Sterling, issue in Los Angeles. Now he was the owner when I played for them, and I had heard all of that kind of stuff, and then to see that come to a point where people just said, no, we're not going to tolerate this. This is not what we're about. And the league's backing of certain issues, whether it's social, economical, certainly with free agency, because that was has always been an issue, but the religion and the freedom to go out and stand arm in arm against whatever it may be that's going on in our country, in our community, and many times the entire world is watching what the NBA does.
And I just want to capitalize on that point, Michael, because you also made a similar point earlier that the NBA really did from the very beginning kind of set a tone for the rest of sports in terms of what they will and won't tolerate when it comes to unionizing, like you mentioned, or allowing Black players into their league. And we've seen that kind of carry over year, decade to decade with the NBA in particular. And it also translates outside of sports in general. We see what happened with 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement and what the NBA was able to do in terms of be a part of that conversation. My question that I want to offer up to you guys that I'm really curious what you think is why that is and why the NBA has that platform and that power about them that they can kind of set a tone or set an example for other leagues to follow or even for people who are watching at home.
I think there are two things actually that kind of separate the league. Obviously, the majority of the league is made up of African Americans. It is 75%, and they are what make the league great. They are why we watch the NBA because of their amazingness on a nightly basis. But along those lines, I think that one thing that the league has that other leagues don't is there is a certain relationship between the players and the owners that might not be as volatile as some of the other leagues, where I think that the owners recognize that these players are more than just quote assets and in people that they employ. And I think that these owners have given them the platform and the voice to speak out on these issues freely, whether it be social justice, whether it be some of their community priorities, whatever it might be that is at the forefront for these players. The league has spoken out in support of it. The owners have spoken out in support of it that you just haven't seen in other professional sports in the United States. And so I think that that's where the NBA has been out in the forefront of this, really going back to way before Donald Sterling. And I think that that's something that's carried over. You certainly haven't seen it in the NFL with what took place with Colin Kaepernick, as he's been blackballed from the NFL. And that's not something that we've seen at all in the NBA. In fact, guys like LeBron James, I think, have allowed players to have the confidence to speak out against whatever it is that they might want to speak out against. And I think that that's what separated the NBA. I really do.
You're right, Chris. And I think you bring up a great point too. That relationship between ownership and players, I think it's apparent. There always has to be an open line of communication that allow them to go back and forth with each other and exchange ideas. I was in the league from 1984 to 2000. David Stern was the commissioner. I always felt like if there was anything that I wanted to talk about with the league, I could go directly to David Stern. Whenever I was playing I never played in New York till my last couple of years, but I always felt like, and they always reached out to me when I came there, hey, would you like to go to see the commissioner, Michael Cage from the LA Clippers? Hey, Michael Cage from the Seattle Sonics, would you like to visit the commissioner today? And so on, Cleveland, Philly, so on and so forth. And I think that working relationship of what, you've had great leadership on both sides. Let's be honest. I mean, having Chris Paul as, the Players Association president right now, I'm telling you, you couldn't have asked for a better person. And he certainly helped, guide and direct the players, and as well as, with the league, we're in conjunction with the league through some really, really tough moments in 2020. And I'm going to throw Adam Silver out there for that too, because now he was not the commissioner when I was in the league, but he was connected, deputy commissioner. He was always in the commissioner's office. To see that kind of willingness to not like say, don't do that, or if you do that, this is what's going to happen, but a more or less like, let me listen first to what you're saying, and then I'll react to it. And I think players feel that. And so players feel like it doesn't matter what nationality you are in the league today, you feel very comfortable knowing that you can speak out on a social issue, I'm not really into the whole political issue with players or whatever, but many times socially, politically, that's connected. But players feel like, probably they didn't feel in 1964 at the All-Star game that if you protest this game, you're going to not be able to play or get endorsements or whatever. They're not under that because of that cooperation, I think, between the leadership of the Players Association and the leadership from the league office.
And Michael, I think that connects to Chris's point just about maybe the differences about the NBA. The NBA and its teams have really tapped into the humanity of its players. And some of those players have even superseded from a power standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from a public persona standpoint. Some of their organizations, you think about, the NFL and some of the NFL teams, they feel more monolithic. They feel more faceless, more nameless. Whereas the NBA, it's not really like that. And I think this all swings back also to that financial freedom. The fact of the matter is NBA players have guaranteed contracts. NFL players, other sports, they're not as much guaranteed or partially guaranteed. In the NBA, it's like having a professor who has tenure at a university. They have the freedom, they have the confidence, they have the institutional support to take chances. And I think what we've seen from guys like Chris Paul and LeBron James and others who have taken stands in the modern era is working off of the back of players that didn't have that really had true courage in Oscar Robertson and Paul Silas, that these guys were laying the foundation, laying the groundwork for the guys to be able to stand up and know that they were going to be secure in what they do while still able to take a stand on certain things. So I do think that what the NBA has gotten right is that power dynamic and that balance in terms of the financial aspect of the league.
I also want to tap into the unique perspective that we all have as broadcasters and talents on air as well. And Chris and Michael, I want to ask you about this experience in particular. August 26th, the Thunder was geared up to play Game 5 in the playoffs against Houston. And that game was ultimately postponed after a series of events happened. There was the shooting of Jacob Blake, and afterwards, Milwaukee decided not to play their game. And in turn, all of the games in the NBA that day were postponed. You guys were about to go on air. You did go on air for a little bit. What was going through your head at that time, and what was that experience and that night like for you guys in particular? Chris, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, you got to go even a little bit before that, because I think for all of us, our emotions were so raw still from George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that had taken place throughout the summer when we were all away from the game. And that was still so fresh in our minds. It was fresh on our country's minds. And so it was fresh on the players' minds. And you couldn't help but think about all those emotions again, sort of reverberate when Jacob Blake was obviously shown shot. So the biggest question for me on that night was how can the players make the most out of this moment? What ultimately can they do to generate some awareness, some change, some effectiveness? That was it. I mean, what can they do? Because they were the ones that were going to be playing the game. They were the ones that felt helpless in the bubble because they weren't out in sort of out in their communities able to do their activism. And so I was really happy to see them have the ability to kind of come together, realize that our voices are strongest together as one. Our voices are strongest here on this platform that was the bubble at that time, which I think a lot of people were kind of paying attention to. And they ultimately came up with a plan, and this goes back to the player ownership relationship, where they pulled in the owners and said, you guys are going to get involved. You have the power from a financial standpoint, you have the power from a civic standpoint, and you have a political power with politicians. You're getting involved. And so they drew in the owners and they said, we're going to set up polling stations. We're going to have voter registration drives. We're going to pump a ton of money into getting people out to vote on TV. We're going to have a lot of civic involvement. One way or another, you're going to get involved. And they did. I think that when you look at the numbers of the people that ended up voting in NBA arenas, it was over 40,000 people that ended up voting in NBA arenas in this previous election cycle. That is a massive number. And so ultimately they did affect change. But going back to that night, the emotions were incredibly raw. I myself couldn't put myself in a player's position, but I completely understood why they did it. They wanted to make some sort of change, and I think that they ultimately did that.
And Chris, just to jump in real quick, I just felt so much for the guys in that situation. You know, coming off of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and then we start to see videos circulating of Jacob Blake, and I just, you know, I could go home to my wife. We could be with our families, or and all of these players down there in the bubble in Orlando are stuck in their hotel rooms. They don't have the outlet. They can't see their children. They can't really, you know, have that human connection. And of all years, of course, 2020 piling on top of that. And so immediately my heart and thoughts, you know, as I was heading to the arena and just thinking about our guys was how are they gonna do this? There's no way that, you know, they've not been inundated with these horrific images. And so, you know, I had a feeling that the stakes were going to be really high, and, you know, was just blown away by what ended up happening. Chris, you really laid it out perfectly of how the players were able to use that situation that was so tragic and horrible and do good out of it, you know?
You know, guys, first of all, you know, I agree with you 100% on what you both said. And if I can add anything at this point, you know, about August 26th, is I put myself, being a former player, in their place. What would I have done? And in my wildest dream, I would not have envisioned so much good coming out of another tragic event. Because you got to remember, man, we were all, as a nation, getting hammered at the time. We had the pandemic going on and the unknowns with that. And we're seeing these graphic images of these, you know, young Black men and women being executed or murdered. It was a lot going on. And then we get a chance to breathe for a minute. You know, we create the bubble, and you're down in Orlando, and it happens again. You know, and this time, like you said, you know, Nick, you're away from your families, and you know, you just get to the point where sports don't matter tonight. You know what I mean? It just don't matter. It's about, as you know, I don't know, I think it was either Fish or Nick, you said this earlier, the humanity part of you starts to just, you know, spill out. Let's speak for humanity, you know, here. And what can we do with this platform? I thought it was brilliant the way the players and the owners got together, came up with, Fish, everything you said, you know, the voting. And then how about this? While the players were down there in the bubble, what, 80% were registered voters, or if not higher? You know, after that, when before, I think those numbers were like, what, in the 30s in terms of the registered voters. So, you know, just a lot coming out at the time, and things were moving so fast. We didn't know if the bubble was going to be successful. It was only August 26th. So
Mike, we
all of a
didn't know if we
sudden,
were going to come back and play. We
Right.
didn't know
Right.
if there was going to be any more basketball for the 1920 season.
yeah.
I remember leaving the arena just being like, all right, guys, hey, maybe we'll have another game. Maybe we won't.
Yeah, and there was just some, I think emotions running high for everybody, and just like I think the league has done in history's past with the '64 All-Star Game, and it's with this inception, being able to just look, how do we make this work? Because we know this something is wrong. We're not gonna act like there's some big pink elephant in the middle of the room and keep walking around it. The league has never done that. And neither has all the players. And I mean, every single player that's put on an NBA uniform has cared about the social injustice, the inequality in this country. I've seen it, I've read it, I saw it through the 80s and the 90s, and I'm seeing it now. So, just to see everybody come together, that collective consciousness of the players, and like you mentioned, Chris, just really just going up to the owners and facing them. Look, come on, we've got to do something here. That we can't go back to the way that things can't go back the way they were before. Where do we go now? And certainly a lot of good things have come out of that. Where do we go now? And it's still coming out.
That proved to be a big catalyst for change. I mean, the entire time the team was in, or the entire time the NBA was in Orlando, it was a really good opportunity. Like you mentioned, Chris, a lot of good things came out of that. They worked together as one to try to promote real, tangible, sustainable change down the road. But personally, on the individual side, I found it, at least for me, a chance for introspection, right? Like there was a lot happening in the league, and there were a lot of different conversations being happening at the time, and it caused me to kind of think inwardly and think, okay, what can I do? What can I learn in these situations to move forward and grow as a person? Did any of you kind of have that same thought or same feeling that this is an opportunity for me to learn as well?
Well, for me, Paris, Nick, and Chris, I spoke to the Oklahoma Chamber of Commerce back in December of 2019. And one part of my speech was on leading by example, and the other part was empathy. And it's a word that we've heard before, but we don't really know how to apply it or what really does it means. And I think that when you talk about the word empathy, I think that's what I'm hoping will come out of all of this, that people will, hey, put yourself in that guy's position, put yourself in that girl's position, put yourself, in these athletes' position, and tell me what you think, because I think you'll really understand sometimes the anger, sometimes the frustration, and sometimes the sadness, man, of what, what's really happened in our past, and how do we create a better future if we don't ever acknowledge these things and say we need to change it, because I put myself in your position.
Yeah,
You know,
Mike, I think just one thing that happened in the aftermath of all of this was, frankly, that the three of us and some of our colleagues got to talk. The four of us and our colleagues got to talk a lot, and
Nick, can I
that was,
interrupt you right there for a second?
yeah,
By the way, when we got together right after all this started happening, especially with the George Floyd thing and the graphic video, talking with you guys, Fish, Paris, everybody from our broadcast team, it was really very, very uplifting, motivating, for me to be a part of that after such unprecedented events happened.
yeah, and I think honestly, it was just a great way. I felt like each of us came to the table with some piece of information that we had learned that we didn't necessarily know about before. I mean, some of just kind of the bureaucratic red tape and things that are involved that prevent these situations from not happening, that continue to allow these things to happen, that some of the information that we learned about the lawsuits that happen after the fact, that it turns out, we all end up paying for the status quo. Some of the information about how these incidents are directly correlated to the income level and the poverty level of the people that are the victims. All of these little pieces of the pie really helped us, I think, figure out just how deep some of these problems truly are, and that we're going to have to be creative, and we're going to have to be diligent to, as a society, try to address some of these things.
Yeah, just to kind of pick up on that a little bit, Nick, as these racial tensions have surfaced in our country, I try to look at it from a positive standpoint and say, if anything, these have shown us how much progress we have to make.
Mhm.
As we have these conversations, and they are uncomfortable ones for many, and they should be, because we haven't been having them enough. And it just goes to show how much more often we need to have them, because America has refused to accept its past, has been in sheer denial, and all of us have to come together and have the conversation to help move us all forward, to have more awareness beyond ourselves, to have more open-mindedness, and to simply just have the dialogue to understand others. And if there's, go ahead, Mike.
Chris, you're right, man, because when we talked after all this happened, um, I really needed to talk to somebody at the time, because we had the pandemic going on. We had all of the anxiety of of an election year, and then so many people out of work, and then we have this happening, and we're in isolation. So just hearing you say it, man, the conversations, like I didn't know the day you and all of us had our first conversation, about social injustice, racial equality, that I never heard you guys speak about it, Paris, included. So it really gave me a window to communicate and express myself, and also hear from my colleagues. Not only, you guys aren't just my colleagues, but you're my friends as well, to hear from you guys on such an event that, man, you can't get away from it. Like it's not like I can go out and talk to my friends, at the games or at a restaurant or at a bar. I mean, we were all in isolation at the time. So I think the communication part, Fish, pardon me for interrupting you as well, was really huge, just to have. And it was a little uncomfortable for me to engage you guys at first, because I've never done that before.
Well, think about how hard it was, even for us, maybe to be as candid as we all were, and we all consider ourselves close. We're friends. We're open-minded. I can only imagine how hard it is for people who don't think the way that we think, and how much harder it would be to maybe have that sort of understanding. And I think that goes along the lines of how much progress we really have as a country, as a community, to really try to accept the past, acknowledge it, create a more awareness, and ultimately affect change, which is going to take time. I mean, we're talking about generations at this rate. And then we all sort of have that responsibility. So it's been a learning experience, and I think that the progress hasn't been enough when you think about the big picture. It's only been, 1950, Mike, we were talking about having to integrate the NBA. I mean, that's ridiculous. There's been progress, but we have so much more to go. So much more to go.
And Chris, I want to follow up on that, because that's a perfect segue into my next question. And it's kind of twofold. You have yourself as an individual, you have what you do for work, and you also have your personal life and your personal growth and development as well. And in these conversations and in our own growth and what we want to learn when it comes to racial equality and racism in our country, how has that kind of impacted, if at all, the way that you do your job, the way that you communicate on air, or the way that you go about work? I'm curious if any of those things, knowing that there's a long way to go still, and knowing that clearly there is a big conviction for self-improvement within all of us, how has that kind of affected how you go about doing your job? And Chris, I'll throw it back to you since you set it up so perfectly.
Well, I mean, we're not in a position here to tell people how to think or to try to convince people to think one way or another. That's never been our role. It's never been our job. We're not a people of opinion that are going to be trying to spew that onto other people. Now, I will say that the Thunder gave us a pretty broad platform during the bubble and during some of those heightened moments emotionally, particularly during discussions of Black Lives Matter. And I never felt like it was my part to try to make things political. But what we've always tried to do is encourage people to think about the issues, encourage people to have an open mind, maybe present something in a way that might get people to kind of think about an issue in a lot of ways, to just kind of get their mind thinking of different points of view, and encourage people to vote and to get involved and to get active. I think that us collectively, that was something that we talked about a lot, was how can we encourage people to get out to vote, which is the ultimate privilege in our democracy, in our country. And so it was a fine line. It was heightened emotions for a lot of different people who probably have a lot of different points of view and a lot of different political standpoints, perspectives, but just trying to create the dialogue rather than force on any kind of position or anything like that. And I think that that's something that we emphasized, and I think we did a good job of it.
Harris, I think about what you and I do and what the privileges that we're afforded as reporters, in that we are embedded with the people that our fans all across the state, all across the country, all across the world care deeply about. And so it is our job to, as we are embedded, to get ourselves into the shoes of the people that we are covering and that our fans care about deeply, and then relay as much of that slice of their humanity as we can back to the fans. And I think part of that, entails understanding that in addition to our audience on the television, our audience is our players as well. And so, as we are doing our job, Paris, we are cognizant of how what we say and write will sound to the guys that we are embedded with every day, and whether it's authentic to how they truly feel, to what their experiences have been, and what they're facing on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that was probably one thing that we were very fortunate about with having Chris Paul on our team last year, is we got an incredible window into how Jacob Blake and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor was affecting not just an NBA player, but a leader of our team, a leader of all of the 450 players in the league, and a parent and a husband, and kind of everything wrapped up into one. And so we had such an incredible window, and really all we had to do was transmit that information back out to the fans in as authentic and genuine way as possible.
Nick just said that about 100 times better than I did. That was good.
He always does, Chris. Don't worry. And I think too, to follow up what you were saying, Nick, historically Black colleges, bringing light to that, what Chris Paul did last year here in Oklahoma City, not knowing what was going to happen moving forward, into 2020. And, for me personally, man, I thought, honestly, our organization, the Oklahoma City Thunder, got ahead of this thing really quickly. And I was actually shocked at how lightning speed they were moving to allow us a platform to be able to speak on, social, injustice, racial equality. It was like so fast that nobody else was talking about it. We were the only ones talking about it. We did a lot of little small Zoom calls, if you remember, even after that were not just amongst ourselves, but that were actually for public consumption on social media platforms. I thought, you know what, that was pretty cool, because I don't always get a chance to speak about things socially, economically, or whatever. It's not my job. I'm in sports, man. This is not, MSNBC for goodness sake. So I don't really get into that kind of stuff, but it really made me feel good to be able to share, with a lot of people a story that I really didn't tell publicly until last year, which was when I was 6 years old. Martin Luther King was assassinated 8 miles from my home. And I remember my mom coming in the room crying and said they got him. And I was like 6 years old. My mother's burying her head in my lap. And I'm like, Mom, what's wrong? She says, Martin Luther King was killed today in Memphis. And so, for me, that was like a very emotional event. It wasn't as traumatic as it was to me back then, but it allowed me to tell that story, to be able to share into people how I felt about something that was so tragic back, in April 4th, 1968. And so, it was really great that we were able to help promote people to register to vote. I thought that was cool. I've never done anything like that in my entire life in a public way like that, where I'm being encouraged, hey, just, get people. It doesn't, we're not, it was all bipartisan, so let's just make that very clear. And it gave us all that platform to do that. And it was right away. I'm talking like, they moved right away on that to create that platform for all of us. So I thought that was really, something that resonated with me now that we're freshly into 2021.
Mikey started to get into the second part of this question, which is kind of the personal side. I mean, none of us are experts here on this topic. All we can do is continue to get better and better every single day. So, what are some of those things that you have found that have helped you kind of move forward and grow personally in this conversation and learn more? I know for me personally, it was whenever all of this started happening, this conversation started coming up more often. I dug into my own family history and learned just a lot about my own family that I didn't know before, and just was ingesting books on this conversation and this topic. And I know everybody probably has done something different, but what are some of those things, those resources, or maybe ways that you've tried to get better in this conversation and in this area that you've tried personally?
Well, I think for me, it's, I'm always so conscious of history, whether it's, social history or, sports history, because many times they go hand in hand. And I've learned so much because of some of, unfortunately, the tragedies and the triumphant moments of 2020 that have opened my eyes to a lot of different things in terms of, the conversations that we're having right now. I've had them with my kids, with my wife, and I've never really had these type of conversations with my family. And it was even with my son, I had to have a different conversation with him, explaining to him about if you get pulled over by the police, these are do's and don'ts that Black people don't do. And I know that sounds weird, but it made me go, to address some issues that I felt I needed to talk to him about, that I never had a conversation with him about. And then a lot of other people, just started sharing stories with me, not necessarily Black people, but other ethnic groups and their fight, for social, justice and racial equality. I was like, there, that empathy part, that thing was popping up again. I was like, well, okay, well, let me put myself in that person's position. Let me put myself in this woman's position, with all the things that women have had to fight for in this country, to vote, equal pay, equal job opportunity. I said, well, I guess I never really, it really kind of made me start thinking that, outside of this reality that I've been living, as a Black American here in America. It really just opened my eyes to other, struggles, other achievements, as well.
Well, Paris, as I kind of tried to think about some of these things a little bit more deeply, I kind of had a twofold approach, and part of it was um, researching what types of progress are possible, or what type of innovation is possible. And part of that, I looked into Campaign Zero and some of their policy proposals that could greatly impact the ways in which our societies operate on a local level, and how important some of those policies actually can be towards affecting true change on the day-to-day level for some of these people who are stuck in behind bureaucracy. They're stuck behind red tape. They're stuck in these situations that are completely obscured from them. And so there's that sort of kind of the new, the innovative, the progress. But then I think there's something that I also kind of got back to and had a little bit more time to in the off season, and that was thinking about what we already know in some case, the wisdom. And for me personally, and it may not be for everybody, but as a Catholic, I kind of thought about um, our faith and some of the things that we kind of know from some of the very first stories of the Bible, that part of being a human being is jealousy, bitterness, tribalism, anger, resentment, some of these darker aspects of human nature that can only be overcome through characterological work, that commitment to doing good, being selfless, and all sort of the values that a lot of maybe us have been raised to aim for, even though we all fall short. And so I try to think of it as a twofold approach, that while we, have opportunities for policy change, we also have to look internally, and we have to assess where we're falling short as human beings, because inevitably we all are going to, because that's what it means to be human.
I'm not going to try to follow that up. Nick said that. Nick said that pretty well. Good. I think that's a good way to end that. Be very introspective.
Come on, Nick. What was that word you said? Characterology? Come
Yeah,
on, man.
I didn't spit it out. I
Like went way up here in the bring it down. Bring it down.
Well, one thing that I do want to just kind of, I think this is a great ending question, and I'll offer it up to the group. And I think it's a really tough question, so just get ready for this one. But obviously, this is not something that you're just going to cross through the finish line and say, we did it, we're done, we have succeeded. This is obviously an ongoing process to continue to learn, grow, get better, be introspective about where you can grow. And so for you guys, I'll offer this up for everybody. What does success look like along the way? What are some of those guardrails and those posts that you can kind of see you're on the right track? So we're on the right track. We're doing the right thing.
Well, I think I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier. This is going to be a long road to recovery that is going to take incremental little bitty steps along the way, to where we try to implement. I'm not quite sure the best way to say it, but we just try to implement these little improvements individually, from a community standpoint, from a country standpoint, where we're having these we're understanding our past, we're having these conversations, and we're trying to implement the change. And I mean, that goes through us as people. It goes through Michael teaching his son, and Nick, I know that you're a new father, in the kind of teaching a lot of those principles into your new daughter. And so it's going to take time. It's going to take generations, probably, because we have so much ground to make up into sort of affecting the psyche of this country. And I mean, I'm hopeful that we will get there someday, but it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of work. And I think that that's something that we noticed in 2020 is just how far we have to go.
Mike, I want you to have the last word, so I'm just going to jump in real quickly. And I think that the key is just, being open-minded to the different types of day-to-day solutions that we could potentially utilize to get us forward down the path. But the real goal is the abstract one. How do we treat every single person in this country with the same level of dignity? And I think dignity is really the word that we should try to have on the forefronts of our brains as we're interacting and going about some of these decisions.
Well, I think that, if I can say, that's a tough question too, Paris.
I
But,
warned you.
you did warn me. And for me, this country was built on racism and discrimination. And we are just now acknowledging it. And we have to realize that, yes, it's existed for centuries, much the same way slavery has existed for centuries in this country prior to 200 years ago. But, what do we do now? Where do we go? I talked about the pink elephant in the middle of the room. We know it's there now. We cannot step around it. And that's what makes me, Fish, I'm gonna go back to you, man. I feel hopeful that people's eyes are now open, once your eyes are open and you know what sunlight looks like, you don't go back to darkness. And we can't go back. We have to keep going forward. Will we stub our toe along the way? Yes, we will. Don't beat yourself up when that happens, okay? When we make mistakes collectively, that's okay. These are all new ideas. But, I like the fact that, a lot of people are talking about this. A lot of people are talking about racial inequality, social injustice. It's not something that's in the history books, because we have to talk about the history. We have to understand that our history in many ways is different. It depends on what point of view. And so for us, to move forward, we have to accept certain conditions. Like, look, I know that this happened. I know that this was not right at one point in time in this country. How do we move forward? And I think that 2020 was a tough year, man. I'm gonna be honest with you. It was exhausting. It was a political year. It was a pandemic year. It was a social injustice protest year. It was a year of unemployment, unlike we've never seen since the 1929 stock market crash. You see what I'm saying, man? It's a lot went down in 2020, and we got here to 21. What do we do, man? We have to keep talking. I agree. Communication. I agree. We have to all accept the fact that, yes, this was wrong. You got to first say this was wrong before you can try to figure out what was right. And that's where I think when I was talking, a couple of questions about empathy, we have to have that in our heart. If we're gonna heal and get better and grow, we have to show empathy.
There's certainly no perfect path here, but and there's a long way to go, certainly, but it all starts with conversations like the one that we just had here today. And so I just want to thank you guys so much for being a part of this roundtable and offering up your experiences and your thoughts. They're so valuable, and we really appreciate you guys taking the time out to do this. So thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
This is the Q&A for the Thunder Roundtable, the terrific keynote address that you've all watched at this point. We have Nick Gallo and Paris Lawson here. They're reporters and digital editors. They were on the presentation. And the way this is going to work, kind of a bigger Q&A here, and as more people come in the chat box, if you type your name and your affiliation, I'll introduce you, and then you can ask your question, and we can kind of go from there of having a conversation, but we'll kind of structure it that way, as this is more people than we've had in some of the other Q&As we've done today. So I'll kick it off to Nick and Paris, if you want to say any opening remarks, and then y'all can indicate attendees in the chat box if you want to ask a question, and I'll introduce you.
Sure. Well, First of all, thanks for having us. Again, my name is Paris Lawson, and I'm broadcast and digital reporter for the Thunder. It was a pleasure to moderate that discussion. Honestly, I'm just really glad to be surrounded by such incredible people that I work with every single day that we can have those sort of conversations. And so I'm really excited to hear what kind of questions you guys have.
Yeah, just to echo what Paris said, I think one of the things about being a part of a NBA organization, a professional sports team, is we are kind of in the trenches together as a broadcast team, and we spend tons of time together, and that really allows us to get to know each other on a personal level. And I think that's what really allows for a conversation like that one to go a little bit deeper and to have some real like meaning and thought behind it, because there's a comfort level with being able to talk to each other and recognize that everyone's coming from a good faith place and coming from a place of wanting to just be honest and talk some of these things through.
Great. First, we have Colleen Colas from MSU Denver has a question. Colleen.
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much. I absolutely love this presentation. It just made me think about so many things. But one thing is that I appreciated you all were so honest about how challenging and difficult some of the conversations were that you all had with each other. Can you share how, and maybe help the rest of us when you're trying to get through those sort of conversations, what allowed you all to feel comfortable enough to share those honest and really difficult sort of conversations after some of those significant events?
Well, I'll go first, and I'll toss it off to Nick because I'm sure he kind of has his own side of the story as well. But I know over the summer, especially, our broadcast group came together, just kind of on our own, really, just having these sort of conversations once a week. And those, like Nick said, we're around each other every single day. We work with each other like really, really regularly, and so knowing each other the way that we did. We just got together and just opened up the floor. I mean, it's one of those situations where the conversation, just coming into it, the conversation is not going to be easy. We all know these sort of conversations are going to be uncomfortable, but I think that's the good in it, right? Like if we came into it knowing that the conversation was going to be easy, it was going to be light and airy, there would be no benefit from it. There would be no reason to have it. And so knowing that the conversation was going to be uncomfortable at times, we kind of leaned into that as a group and understood that the only way to get better, the only way to grow, the only way to, take a step forward was to be a little uncomfortable and be stretched a little bit. So I think as a group, we kind of leaned into that a little bit, and just, we all knew each other and where we were coming from when we had these sort of conversations. And it was all very honest, very open. And I think it really did allow us to take a step forward. Gallo, I'll let you kind of build on that. I'm sure you have your own thoughts there.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would just say is, Paris and Michael and Chris and I have like hundreds, thousands of other touch points with each other on all sorts of different things to recognize that, we have empathy for one another, we care for one another, we, are just kind of generally like nice people, good to each other. And so when things like these types of conversations happen, and maybe there are disagreements or misunderstandings, or some of us might not know something about what one of the other people is talking about, there are like all of these other touch points that allow for that grace that's needed. And I think a lot of times where these difficult conversations are attempted to be had these days are on social media, where no one has any other touch points with these people other than a 140 character tweet. And so I think the fact that when you have some of these conversations in a real community, in a community where you're spending hours on planes and buses and nowadays Zoom calls with people, you have all these other different avenues of knowing one another that aren't just a quickly fired off thought. And so I think that deeper level of connection is something really to try to strive for before you have these types of talks.
Great. We'll go to Heather Alderman, who's Cosmo's executive director.
I apologize for hitting the enter key before I had actually written a question out. So what advice would you have for other sport organizations for either starting these conversations or picking up at an appropriate point where they can, as you said, push themselves a little bit farther? Because it honestly, it seems like you all are in a very different and unique place, and that not all organizations are necessarily, I mean, I hate to use the word advanced, but it seems like you've processed a lot of this already. So there's, not everybody is going to be in the same position. So what advice would you have at different stages of sort of awareness or understanding or rapport?
Well, Paris, I just to jump off, I think the key is authenticity, and also, doing things internally first before you do anything outward facing. And I think one of the things that we really benefited from was the fact that we had some people within our organization with kind of authentic experiences and stories to tell. We did, a kind of an internal discussion between some of our Black fathers in the Thunder organization that I thought really resonated with people. And these are people that we work alongside every day, and recognizing, to like kind of giving them that opportunity and that platform to talk about how the events of the summer were affecting them, I think was a great way to get the conversation going internally first. And then, being able to kind of expand, what we talk about as an organization in a forward facing way after that.
Yeah, just to echo that, Nick, you took my point perfectly. But what I was going to say was you kind of have to start with that gut check first with internally and within the people that you work with every single day. Because when stuff like this happens, the people that you work with every day and the people that you're around, I mean, those are the ones that are affected, right? Like those are the people that you're going to see and talk to the most. And so I think for our organization in particular, we do a really good job of just looking out for each other and kind of taking care of our people. And so that was the first thing that we did. And we just talked to one another and had those conversations, checked in with everybody. How are you doing? How are you feeling? And then from there, you can kind of build up. It just starts at that level of that caring level. And kind of what Nick was talking about earlier, just like, having those community touch points within your everyday, right? Like you know each other, you know where you guys are coming from, your heart. And so just starting there with those sort of check-ins, I think is key and critical to having these sort of conversations, and then just laying that foundation that you can build on to take more kind of action steps moving forward. But it starts there with that kind of community level, one-on-one gut check. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Those sort of conversations.
And just to follow up, with your question was about what can, other sports teams do. And I think that's a big part of Paris and I's role, is to get a read on the players and the coaches and the staff members, so that we have an authentic view of where those people are coming from, our most forward facing members of our organizations, what their experiences have been, where they're coming from, so that we're not putting those people into situations to answer questions or be the face of a conversation that they might not really have a story to tell about or feel comfortable being in those spots. And then on the flip side, recognizing which players, which staffers truly do have authentic stories to talk about, or have a willingness to enter that conversation, so that we're not thrusting people into a spotlight that they might not want.
For everyone that's joined us since the start, if you have a question for our broadcast team from the Oklahoma City Thunder, indicate your name and your affiliation in the chat box, and we'll get to you in order of those being put in there. Our next question is from Maggie Tudor at the University of Tampa.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you both and your team members too. Your roundtable, your openness and your authenticity and your sharing was amazing. So really, thank you for all that. I have so many questions, but I'll try to prioritize for time. At University of Tampa, we have a lot of task force, and I'm a part of a diversity task force specifically for students and creating an open and safe space for students. And so I've been starting to have those conversations specifically in my classes that I teach, which are sport management classes. And, you know, we are not a very diverse university in our program. The majority are white males. And so those conversations are a little tougher to get conversations going, but also with in mind that these students need to be prepared to have the conversations when they get into the workforce. So I wanted to see if you had any advice for us as professors to prepare students to have these conversations when they do get into the workforce, because I think, you know, it's just the conversation's going to keep happening.
I'd love to jump in here just because I'm 3 years removed from college now. And so this, you know, having these sort of conversations at work, it is kind of new territory for me as well. But one of the things, and I just keep bragging on the people that I work with just because, you know, they're incredible. But, you know, being surrounded by good people is important to know that you can kind of have these conversations in sort of that safe place and that safe environment. But I think what kind of armed me going into it was, you know, having that foundation of like integrity as a person, and like that authenticity as a person, and just being like secure in kind of who I am, knowing that, you know, when I come to these new situations or when I get into these new environments, that I still have like this voice that I can share, and like staying true to that. And so I don't know if that made a lot of sense, but essentially just coming into the conversation, coming into this new environment, kind of secure in who you are, securing kind of what your truth is, but also recognizing that your experience, what you've lived in life, it's just yours, right? And so when you get into these new environments, these new situations, new circumstances, you're going to be surrounded by a lot of new people. And like you mentioned, it's a bubble kind of there in that classroom. It's a bubble there in that campus. And so arming them with the knowledge that there are going to be a lot of new perspectives out there. There are going to be a lot of new thoughts and experiences and backgrounds. That's okay. Lean into that. And your truth, who you are as a person, that's you, and that's your identity. But it's not everything, and it's not everybody's. And I think just having that mentality coming into my new organization with the Thunder, I think really helped me kind of like understand and soak in all of the conversations that I did have, because there were some really, really good conversations. Like Nick was talking about, I moderated that conversation with Black fathers in our organization, and that really just went so deep, and it just said so much about the people that I worked with. But again, I am not a Black dad. And so being able to lean into those conversations and soak in all the lessons that they had to say was really vitally important. And so the biggest thing I would say is just kind of leaning into the fact that what you know now is that's all that you know, but there's so much more perspectives, more thoughts, and that's okay. That's important, actually. So lean into that.
Yeah, just to maybe circle back to something that you said within your question that kind of sparked something was, you'd mentioned creating an open and a safe space. And I think the biggest thing there is defining the terms, defining what you mean by open, defining what you mean by safe. My advice would be that the term safe should be, safe from obviously, attacks and truly offensive language, but also safety from ostracism, because people are going to come to this with maybe far-ranging views, and without safety from ostracism from the group, there's a huge opportunity for people to feel completely shunned from the conversation, and therefore unable to learn from one another. So I would, and that's just my take. Your definitions of the terms open and safe, I think, are very, very critical. And I think especially for college students, knowing the boundaries of what an open and safe place entails is really, really critical.
Great question. Any questions for our Thunder broadcast team here, Paris and Nick? So they have time for about one more question if someone wants to finish it up here.
I'll jump in.
Okay. Dr. Pam Wojnar from Northeastern University.
So dovetailing on what you just said, Nick, who defines safe? And what if the people in the group are defining it on polar opposite spectrums?
That's a great question. I guess my answer to that would be whoever's kind of if you're in charge of a classroom, if you're in charge of an organization, if you're in charge of a team, at some point, kind of the management, the leadership is the one that is defining those terms. In a friend group, that might be something that's done collectively, but in a more structured situation, like on a college campus or a professional sports team, I mean, all of the things that we've talked about here today have been a result of the incredible leadership that exists within the upper levels of our organization. We receive incredible support. We receive incredible trust to have these types of conversations, to identify who would be, potentially the best people to speak to our group on behalf of our group. And so I think the leadership is the people that defines those terms. And obviously, kind of the proof of whether those definition of terms is correct will come through how those conversations actually go and how people react to one another, and whether there is, a feeling of trust and safety and comfort within the group, or whether it becomes something different and something uglier as a result, based on what those terms actually are defined as.
I want to build on this too, because I think this is why culture is so important in your organization, because obviously the events of this summer and, everything that happened in 2020, we had never faced before, not as a league, not as an organization. And so not having to define those sort of things on the run, I think was kind of important for, in general anyway, because the culture and kind of what we established early on as an organization of kind of taking care of our people. We're going to look out for you. I got so many calls just, whenever all of the events started happening, just personally, like one-on-one checking in with me. And so kind of knowing that you have that sort of trust, you have that sort of, care and, personal touch, I guess, within your organization it was already there for me personally. And so knowing that as a foundation allowed these conversations, I feel like I felt like it was a super safe space just based on what this culture of the organization stood for in general. So that's why I really think just what your organization stands for in general and what you set as a tone from the outset is just so important, because when things get tough, when things go south, that's when that's tested and the most. And you don't want to have to scramble and try to figure things out on the fly there. And I'm sure some of that is going to happen anyway, especially when you're dealing with unprecedented situations. But having that strong foundation, having that strong culture makes it a lot easier.
Great. And I know Nick and Paris are out of time, and want to thank them again for doing this Q&A and having the roundtable discussion as well. And thank Chris and Michael. I know they're not here, and thank Cara for setting all of this up. It was, as everyone said, extremely insightful and really great to hear. I know y'all have to go pick up a daughter from school, and Paris get working on actual job stuff. But thank y'all for taking the time. If the rest of you want to finish up the 10 minutes left in this Q&A and continue this conversation, you're more than welcome. But I want to thank Paris and Nick and Cara as well for setting all of this up. Thank you.
Thank you guys for having us.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for the great questions. It really enjoyed having a conversation about this.